one of the things that I think I've learned in my time in L&D is face the challenge that's in front of you, and sometimes don't try and look at what other businesses are doing, because whilst their gamified learning program or very fancy mentoring program might be amazing, it might not be the answer that your business needs. You kind of free the reins and you can almost decentralize learning in a way, and then learning becomes something that the business co-creates as opposed to it being a single department. Interestingly enough, I remembered that I used to listen to a podcast called L&D Disrupt. And that's how I remembered How Now. I was like, let me have a look, see what these guys are up to. And then there you were, and you had the How Now Plus piece that was fairly new, I think, at the time. And I was like, okay, this is good.
This is how we learn now.
This episode of L&D Disrupt is brought to you by How Now, the learning platform that actually makes learning matter. Because let's face it, you could push out loads of content, track skills in a spreadsheet, drown in admin, and still not know what's working. Or you could use How Now to connect your people to the skills they need. Deliver learning in the flow of work and prove it's making a difference. That's how modern companies like Depop, Trainline, Crunchyroll, So Energy, Forsaven, TomTom, Investec, and so many more do it. Learn more at gethownow.com.
Menna, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
I'm really, really excited.
Me too.
Because I know we've spoken, I've spoken to the team about all the great stuff that you're doing, and I'd love to kind of dive into it. But before we do that, you were just telling me you've been in L&D for 9 years, or coming up to 9 years.
Yeah.
You remember the first job you did in L&D?
Yeah, so my first job was a training coordinator for a business process outsourcing business, which is a bit of a mouthful. But essentially my role at the time, weirdly, my friend, this is going to sound weird based on our conversation now, but my friend at the time was the training coordinator. She moved to Australia for the year, so her role became a seconded position. I applied for it on the whim and got it, and she decided to stay in Australia. So my role became permanent, and that's kind of how I got into L&D. But it was really focused on building out a lot of sort of programs, but really just working with facilitators and just really like the behind the scenes work. But I absolutely loved it, and yeah, kind of stuck. So
What's changed in L&D in these 9 years?
oh, well, I mean, the fact that my role was a training coordinator to start with, I think is a big one. I think if you said that to somebody in L&D now, they'd think you were swearing at them. Like we don't call it training anymore. And whilst that is definitely still a big part of any sort of L&D strategy, I think it's come on leaps and bounds since just training delivery,
And do you think what's expected of you has changed in those 9 years? When you think about L&D and what the business wants from L&D, do you think that's changed much?
Yeah, I think it has. I think a lot of the time before, it was very much compliance-led stuff, and more about, doing what ticks the box. What do we have to do as an organisation to make sure that we've ticked that training box requirement? And now I think it's more about how does learning play a part in business impact and business outcomes, which is very different from have you done your data protection training,
And so what does that look like in practice, right? To know whether you're having business impact, you first kind of need to know what's the desired impact you want to have, right? So what does that look like for you as a process? How do you figure out what business challenge or problem to focus on?
Yeah, and that's a really big question. And I think oftentimes, especially in L&D, where I'd say L&D people are quite creative people, and you can very quickly become swept up in what's going on out in, the rest of the industry or the rest of the world. And that can sometimes be a really hard challenge to navigate on its own. But one of the things that I think I've learned in my time in L&D is face the challenge that's in front of you, and sometimes don't try and look at what other businesses are doing, because whilst their gamified learning program or very fancy mentoring program might be amazing, it might not be the answer that your business needs. And that's cool, and you can learn from them, and you could maybe take some of their concepts and practices, but you have to face that challenge in front of you. And you have to do that by speaking to the people in your business, and acting as a consultant, I'd say, is quite a big one for that.
I mean, that really resonates, because it's almost like, we always talk about starting with first principles, like boil down the problem to its like fundamental truths, rather than often what we see L&D professionals doing is the opposite of that, which is kind of reasoning by analogy. I do this because they're doing this, or
Yeah.
I'm doing this because I saw this on LinkedIn and so is doing this. And what you don't realize you're doing is when you kind of reason by analogy, you're inheriting someone else's assumptions. And if those assumptions are flawed, then you're kind of carrying over those flawed assumptions and, building on top of flaws, which is set up for disaster from the get-go.
100%.
But how do you kind of get into... It's sometimes easy to go, oh, so-and-so is doing that, therefore it must be good, so let me do that. So how do you make sure you are kind of scrutinizing and challenging it and really seeing whether it's fit for you or not?
I mean, one of the things that we talk about in my team quite a lot, and that's not just in L&D, but actually as a wider people department, we've kind of adopted the one fundamental question is, what are we trying to achieve? And that's it. Like, if someone says, hey, Menna, I saw this really cool thing on LinkedIn, we should do that. It's like, okay, cool. What are you trying to achieve if we do that? And I think often people are like, I don't know. And then you go, okay, that's fine. But it's not necessarily a bad idea. And it's definitely something we can explore. But let's figure out what it's trying to achieve. And then most of the time you come up with a wildly different solution anyway. So I think sometimes it's about being able to recognize what other people are doing isn't bad and you can learn a lot from it, but always coming back to, but what do we need out of it? And if that is a mentoring program, cool. If it's a management program, cool. But even that, like, someone could come to me and go, we need a management program. And I could fundamentally agree with them. And they could say, oh, but they're focusing on this. And it's like, okay, do we need to focus on that? Like, do we actually need to focus on that? And it's just always coming back to that question of, what do we want it to look like? What are the success metrics? And if someone does this thing that we're saying is cool and needs to be done, what are we expecting to see that's different or changed as a result of it?
What does a good answer to that question look like?
I don't think there's ever a good answer, to be honest. I think it's just about an answer that whoever your stakeholders are, and you're included in that for sure, are all aligned on it. I don't necessarily think there's a right or wrong answer.
Right.
I think as long as you can all come to an agreement of like, yeah, that sounds like what we're trying to do, then try it.
Yeah.
And because like I say, L&D people are very creative as well. And I think having the ability and flexibility to be creative in your solutions is very important. But, I think it's constantly boiling things down. So, for example, if it's onboarding, we want to decrease ramp time. I've heard that a few times. Decrease it by what? And it's really about boiling down into those like granular details, which I think is sometimes skipped and sometimes missed, because that's when people say, oh, I'm struggling to prove impact. Well, yeah, probably, because you'd never actually defined what that was in the first place. So if you want to reduce ramp time, say it's 90 days, what do you want to reduce it to? 60, 45, 30? Because then at least if your first solution doesn't match that, you've got some sort of insight of, okay, well, did it reduce a little bit?
Yeah.
And then you can start to pick on, okay, well, why did it reduce a little bit? What can we do differently next time? So I don't know. I've waffled a little bit there, but
Absolutely. Like, as in, like, you checking whether you're moving in the right direction or not, right? To see whether you're having any sort of impact or not. Because if it's getting worse, then
that's the
you
problem.
probably...
Yeah.
But in practice, what does that look like, right? So if I was to play out, do you come into the year with like an annual strategy for L&D? And if yes, what's that based on?
So yes and no. I think there's a lot of narrative in the L&D world about being proactive, and I agree with that. I think you do need to be proactive. You need to look at things like, well, what is the future of work? What are the future skills that people need? For example, AI. Like, we've been talking about it for a while. It's really starting to come into play now. And I think as an L&D leader, you should have been thinking about that a while ago, right? But I do also think you've got to leave a little bit of room for reaction and like reactivity as well, because if you haven't got that, if something changes in the business, you're like, oh, well, actually, no, I've had this strategy and I've built that to 100% capacity, so I now can't veer from that. It's like, that probably doesn't work. Like at Dot Digital, we went through an acquisition and that just blew the strategy out of the water, because it meant that we all had to react to that change in the business and do something differently. So yes, I think you should have a strategy in terms of what can we foresee is going to happen over the next 12 months, let's say, but always leaving room for but that could change and something could go wrong in that time too, and allowing yourself that wiggle room, I guess.
And how do you come up with that? Is that a case of the business going, look, here's the objectives we want to achieve, and then you're trying to figure out what can we do that's going to feed into that so you can kind of connect those dots?
Yeah, so we at Dot Digital we have corporate OKRs. So we use an OKR system, which is great. And one of our sort of main OKRs is build a great corporate culture for our people. And I mean, that leaves a lot of room for discussion around what that could look like. And I think the best thing that you can do is, yeah, I mean, take advice from what's going on out in the industry. But again, like kind of what I said about face the challenge in front of you, speak to the people in front of you as well. And that's something that we do quite a lot of. We look at things like our engagement survey data. We run a lot of like user groups and workshops, and we read reviews. Like we actually read things in detail and actually listen to what our people are saying. So that can definitely shape quite a lot of what we do. So for example, something that I run at Dot Digital is the Power Skills series, and that's every month we have a different topic of focus on a particular power skill. But those power skills weren't really identified by me, they were identified by the business, and they were things that people felt like they needed in their role. And we've seen really good engagement from that because, well, they kind of co-created it, so it makes sense, you know?
So what does one of these user groups or workshops look like?
Oh God, I mean, there's loads of different types. We used user groups for our Dot Digital values, which was quite a big project for me. And it was really just about discussing like what's actually going on in the business, what are some of the challenges that you're facing, or what do you love about Dot Digital? And it really is just open forum discussion so that we can understand what people think and how people feel and how they feel about Dot Digital. Because ultimately, I think for me, learning is a very, very social construct, and you need to be able to embed that into nearly everything that's going on in the business for it to actually have an impact. So if, for example, through these workshops and discussions, people are saying, oh, well, actually, we use this tool and you've got a million different ways of doing one thing. It's like, all right, then that's quite challenging. And then a lot of energy is focused on that one thing. And it's like, well, if we could fix that one thing, people have more time to focus on learning and growth and development, etc. So yeah, it's really just open forum that allows people to chat and we learn from them, really.
And, one of the things that really stood out is kind of speak to people, right? Like
Yeah.
get to people in the business and speak to them. And I mean, it sounds like such an obvious thing to say, but quite often it comes up where that's not happening, or there's a reluctance or nervousness to do it because
Yeah.
if it's been like an L&D function that's kind of operated in a silo, running compliance and running
Yeah.
things like generalist onboarding, they've not really built that relationship with some of the other functions to be able to ask those questions and understand what they need. What's your advice there? Like, how do you overcome that?
Do you know what? This has actually been quite a big learning curve for me at Dot Digital because it's just a different setup to previous companies that I've worked for, and that sort of stakeholder engagement has been so important. And I think, I mean, the advice, and this is just from personal experience, is don't take things personally. Like you will get things wrong, and you will have made wrong decisions, or not even wrong decisions, but decisions that people don't, really agree with, and you can't take that personally. And sometimes, especially if, when I joined Dot Digital, there was no such thing as L&D. Like they'd never had an L&D person before. So you can imagine there was quite a lot of venting that needed to happen when I joined, because people expect it now. It's, it's not really a nice to have anymore. It's a need to have. And let people vent, let people have that, outburst if they need to, and then work with them from there. I think that for me has been a learning curve, is that people will ultimately need to have that, like, I'm unhappy about this, or this is a challenge for me and I need to complain about this, because then you can move forward from it. I think giving people that space to do that means that they then go, oh, okay, I feel heard and I feel listened to, and now we can solve this problem together. Whereas if you don't do that and don't give people that outlet, you'll probably build something that isn't going to work, and then you break down that relationship again because I haven't been heard again, and actually this isn't what I wanted, this isn't what I needed. So yeah, I think that's the advice, is don't take things personally, let people vent, and you will be able to build a better relationship with them from there.
Is that a lot of pressure? Like coming in as a first L&D person, everyone's bending out going, this has not been good, that's been rubbish. And they're almost looking at you like, you're going to change everything, right?
Yeah, it was a lot of pressure. It was, yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't have anything else to say. It was a lot of pressure, but I guess one of the things that helped me is that it was all new for me as well. I didn't know the business. It's not that I'd, worked for Dr. Digital for years and I understood the business and I then moved into this role. I didn't know the business. I didn't know anything. And I was kind of, a little bit removed from anything that happened previously because I wasn't there. So, yes, it was a lot of pressure, but it was also a really nice opportunity to go,
Yeah.
do you know what? Yeah, let it all out. Tell me all the problems because I now have this amazing blank canvas to work from. And that was an amazing opportunity. So, yeah, I guess pressure is a privilege in that sense.
Pressure's a privilege. I like that one. Going back to strategy, so like you've formed this strategy, running your user group, speaking to people. Um, how do you then validate that, okay, this is what the business needs and it's going to move the metric that the business cares about? How do you kind of connect those dots between what you're doing in learning
Yeah,
and the business metric that you're trying to move?
I think they should be the same. Like, ultimately, they need to be the same. I think a lot of the time I see people build these programs and they're like, oh, so our metrics are training hours and bookings. And it's like, yeah, they're indicators and they're definitely things you want to track. But ultimately, if the business goal is to retain staff, well, okay, let's think about how that plays out in a learning program. So if we are going to focus on management development, because, people don't leave businesses, they leave managers. So let's link that back. Well, we want our managers to be able to retain their staff, automatically linked to the business goal of staff retention. Do you know what I mean? So it kind of has to be the same. And then once you've got that, you go, okay, well, how does the management program need to be built in order to attain that outcome? Well, is it that the managers need more development on interviewing skills? Maybe, or it could be resilience, or it could be handling difficult conversations, or it could be enabling your staff. And then it's about getting the data from the different sources. So, what is it that people will stay for? Finding that information and then pulling that into whatever learning program that you're doing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I guess how do you get the data right to figure out whether it's working or not? Because often that is the kind of block or challenge I hear is, it's not easy to access the data I need to demonstrate whether I'm adding value to the business or not. Have you had challenges with that, and how have you overcome that?
Yeah, so one of the things when I joined Digital, we were looking at our engagement survey action. I would say if that's not a data source that an L&D person is looking at, change it because it's a really good data source. But we were looking at it and I was like, oh, what are we trying to achieve with these questions? And honestly, I'm going to keep saying that because that is my like pinnacle of a question is
Great
what
question.
are we trying to achieve? And
Yeah.
I think then if we're looking at adding in learning and development, which we were at the time, it was new, it was a blank canvas, there wasn't really that many questions about learning and development in the engagement survey. So it's like, okay, make sure the questions are in there. And then it was based on, okay, well, what is the strategy? And the strategy at the time was very much focused on management. So we created the category of my manager and me. So it just, sometimes it's almost like reverse engineering things. And the data isn't always going to be right, quote unquote, right. But it's kind of the story that you tell with the data. And also, if you're not looking at data yet, set that up. So think about like what data could you expect to see? Like we as a department haven't actually been using the OKR structure for that long. And some members in the team are like, we don't know what the data is going to look like at the end of the 12 months. We don't have an expected outcome. We just need to collect it. And I guess that's probably your starting point. And that's where I needed to start. We didn't have anything when I started. So it was, well, what do we want to know? And then build any questions or data inputs around that question.
And how do a lot of people find data quite abstract sometimes, right? So how do you figure out, not always lots of data isn't always a great thing. So how do you pick out what data is right to form that story that you want to tell?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'd say there's room for all sorts of data. And as an L&D person, I would say collect as much data as you possibly can. But you kind of hit the nail on the head already by saying what story do you actually want to tell. And for example, these Power Skills series that we've been running, we've been doing a similar version called the Leader Labs, and that was new for last year, so it's been running 12 months now. And we did a 6 months pulse check, and I thought, oh my goodness, like how do I tell this story? And it wasn't actually in the attendance rates that I found the story. It was in the repeat bookings. Because you think, well, people don't book onto things out of busy days or rebook onto things if they find it invaluable, if it's not valuable to them. So I think sometimes it's about being curious with the data that you have and thinking, well, what does that actually tell you? And being able to tell the story from there. So, you could have attendance rates, you could have training hours. For me, it was repeat bookings, which, that's not abstract. That's fact. People have made bookings and they've then gone on and booked again. And you can't argue with it,
Do you think
So,
you could develop curiosity?
yeah. Yeah, I do. I think most things are a skill. There's so many things that people think, oh, that's not a skill. It's a trait or a talent. And it's like, well, yeah, but most of the things now you can break down. And I think curiosity in itself is just the ability to ask really effective questions. And it doesn't matter whether that's to a person or whether that's to a dashboard in front of you going, well, what are you trying to tell me here? And like playing with things, moving things around, like just being able to ask good questions. I think the more you do that, the more curious you can become.
And with measuring data, right? I guess there's almost a bias I sometimes see towards like quantitative data. Like it's got to be
Yeah.
numbers, and people almost, I guess, undervalue the qualitative data of, if I interviewed someone and they said something to me, there's something in that intangible
Yeah.
piece there. Do you find that in data?
I do. And I think, being completely honest, I am more biased to quantitative data because to me, like you say, it's not abstract, it's factual. But actually, the more curious I've become with things, the more I've realised that actually that qualitative side of the feedback and the data is probably more important because ultimately that data is what's telling your story for you, and we obviously use How Now, and we've got the wonderful review feature, and we use the webinar feature for the Power Skills series. And honestly, it's the reviews that I think have really helped drive further attendance. So when we initially started, we weren't getting loads and loads of people attend. It was fairly new, and people don't know the value of it yet, right? And one of the things that I started to do was share what your colleague has said about the previous session in Slack or in Bob, which is our HRIS. And since we started to do that, we saw a massive uptick in attendance rates, and sometimes not attendance, but at least people booking on. So I think that really does show the value of the qualitative data and I guess social proof. And that's probably something that L&D leaders should tap into more is the social proof of their work.
You know what? That's like an incredible marketing move there, right? Do you think L&D need to be marketeers as well?
1000%. I'm very lucky I work for a marketing business, so I get to learn a lot of tips from the wider team there. But I think, yeah, communication and marketing in L&D is a sort of underrated skill for sure.
How can I build it?
Oh, more learning and development. I don't know. I think there's lots, again, curiosity, try different things. And, there is a lot of learning out there that you can do. And I would honestly recommend anyone going and just not figuring out, but having a look online to see this is where I would suggest going and seeing what other people are doing, because that bit of marketing for L&D, well, it kind of depends on the business, right? But I think that is a skill within itself. And to learn about that, you have to try new things. So like play with things, have fun with things. And I think that's definitely a way to learn. But yeah, definitely do some research and, practice what you preach, maybe get a mentor as well.
It always surprised me because like most organizations have a marketing function. And again, it goes back to kind of sitting in a silo and, really you're probably looking across search engines, etc., on marketing tactics, etc. But you've got experts right in your
Yeah.
organization and probably like sitting across the room that
Yeah.
you can go and ask. And yeah, often I find it's that kind of that social anxiety if you've not built that relationship, but also the curiosity to want to know and want to experiment. And sometimes I find a big part of that is kind of culture, right? Like, do you have the psychological safety in the organization to be able to experiment and try? How do you build that environment for you to feel comfortable to play and experiment and try things out?
Yeah, I think that's a really hard one. And that for me comes from probably not even just the management, department. I think that actually comes from like your ethos as a business, and that's a really hard thing to try and implement. And I don't necessarily think that's the sole responsibility of L&D, but I do think L&D can influence it by trying to build some of that, time to play and experiment into their learning programs. So, for example, I'm actually doing something recently where we're kind of doing a blended approach to learning, where we're sending people on an online self-led course, but we're doing an internal program, like wraparound, I guess. And we're asking them to put some of it into practice. It's actually on effective public speaking. So we're going to give them a bit of a task and say, right, okay, you now have to deliver a public speaking session to the rest of your region. And that is an opportunity to play and try something, but it's internal with their team members. There's no pressure if they get it wrong. And hopefully that then gives them because again, that's kind of what L&D is. It's not just about knowledge and skills. It's about building confidence
Yeah.
in people to try, right? And that, I think, is a really good way for L&D to influence that behavior of play, curiosity, try things, learn things, because really that's, where innovation stems from as well. So it's good for business. But yeah, try and just implement that into your learning programs to create those, scenario-led things, just experimental time. And, sometimes that can even just be reflection time, because people often don't have time to even think anymore, So
I mean, from this conversation, it's quite clear, obviously, engagement isn't the end goal that we're working towards, but it is the primary requirement for any of that good stuff to happen, right? For behavior change, performance improvement, and business impact to happen, you need to first engage people. And obviously, being your learning technology partners, one thing that's been evident is you've been incredible at driving that engagement. What's the secret sauce?
yeah, I've been thinking about this quite a lot, and I really want to say it's me, but it's not. It's really not. I think there's a few things here that have really helped. Timing of learning, I think, is so important. When you start digging into adult learning theory, the context is so important. And if you're launching something that just feels a little bit like, oh, that doesn't fit quite right with what we're doing as a business, then naturally people are going to switch off. So something that we've done at Dot Digital is almost like campaign-led learning, where whatever we've been focusing on as a business in that time. So for example, when we launch our performance reviews, our annual performance reviews, we run performance training. And we run it through, I was going to say Milo, that's our internal name for How Now. But we run it through How Now. So you see engagement on the platform, but you see engagement then with the learning, because it makes sense for them to do the learning then, because that's what's going on in the business at the time. So that's one of the things I'd say has been really, really helpful. I'd say the other thing is I think there's a lot of power in credibility in expert voices. And something that we talk about, or did talk about a lot when I first joined, was this concept of pockets of excellence. And kind of going back to what we said to before, there's a lack of willingness to speak to other departments sometimes, right? And I also think a lot of L&D feel like they have to be the expert, they have to know, which is just so not true. And like almost be okay with being a newbie and being okay with learning yourself. So reaching out to people going, hey, we need to do this thing. I have no idea about this thing. Can I have your help with it? Makes a massive difference, because if you've got someone from the platform team training someone on the platform, well, they're credible. They know what they're talking about. If you've got someone from the product team teaching the commercial team about the product and how to sell it, well, it's credible. They know what they're talking about. So I think sometimes it's about expanding your reach. So timely learning, but also learning that taps into those pockets of excellence and the knowledge that you've got in the business, and connecting those individuals.
Yeah, I think especially the first point around, that's really learning in the flow of work, right? I think
Yeah.
sometimes learning in the flow of work, people trivialize it into, oh, it's a nudge that shows up within an app. And, I always separate that into that's like a micro moment in
Yeah.
your day, right? Like I'm on a call with a customer, there's a question, I get an answer. But there are like macro moments, which is around, I've just been promoted and I'm about to have my first one-to-one with a direct report.
Yeah.
Or we're doing a performance review cycle. And I think it's incredible to be able to almost tie it in to that moment, because you're essentially capturing the relevance that comes from that moment, right? And I
Yeah.
think this is a challenge where, how do you make it personalized? And this I see as almost a very powerful way of personalizing learning at scale because we're
Yeah.
all going through that macro moment together.
Yeah, 100%. I think that exactly. That's probably the first step, isn't it? Going, well, what actually happens every year as a business? Because we all have processes and things happen on a regular basis, and trying to tie learning into those moments is really powerful because, yeah, like you say, it's relevant to people, and people will then go, oh yeah, well actually I need to know this right now, so it's important to me, so I'm going to do it. And then there's then sort of drilling it down onto the more individual level. And I think that's when learning technology has played such a massive part. And, we use like custom rules and learner groups in How Now and stuff like that. So basically, anytime someone becomes a manager at Dot Digital, whether they're a new manager to the business or they've recently been promoted, they change groups in How Now, which then distributes more learning pathways to them, which is just amazing because, well, I'm talking about my training coordinator role, that would have been really handy back then, rather than be like, oh, let me print out all of these guides for somebody. But yeah, I mean, I think that's where you start to drill down into that individual level. And again, it's making it relevant. And we have got other things in play. Even if someone says, oh, I'm interested in becoming a manager, great, trigger. And that sends them information there. And yeah, I think there's lots of things that you can do to make it relevant.
What are your kind of feelings around AI's role in, I guess, connecting learning with business, right? Like, where are you in that in terms of experimenting and playing, and what's your feelings around it?
I mean, AI is such a big, big topic. And I do think a lot of people still feel quite scared of AI. I think it's amazing. And I don't think it's not going anywhere anytime soon. But I mean, some of the stuff that we can do with AI to make learning more personal to someone is incredible, like even ChatGPT and the chat models and stuff like that. We've actually developed our own ChatGPT internally, and we can use it for things like RFPs, and people can ask questions about the business. So, it's great. But from a learning and development perspective, I do think the opportunities are kind of endless in terms of how you can make a really pretty amazing learner experience for somebody. But then selfishly, as an L&D professional, like, it's amazing for things like content creation and stuff like that. I think it is just finding the balance of making sure things aren't so automated that you lose the personal touch. And I think that's something that at Dot Digital we're doing quite well at the moment. But yeah, just don't lose touch that people still want to be able to talk to another human being and learn from a mentor or a peer or something. But AI can be a really nice addition and bolster to that, I guess.
Yeah, I think we find the same. Like, our big bet is definitely prolific use of AI is making our tolerance for anything that's kind of passive and asynchronous very low, right? Like,
Yeah.
the chances of sitting there for a couple of hours and watching a course, is probably already questionable. But like now,
Yeah.
there'll be a very few niche use cases for where that might be fit for purpose. But otherwise, we're going to expect things to be very kind of real time, hyper personalized. And there's really only two ways we think you can meet that expectation, and that's one is through AI, and you've probably seen a sneak peek of kind of Guru with our
It
AI
looks
agent,
amazing. Yeah.
and that's where an AI agent can be hyper personalized in real time. But the other one, like you said, is we're betting big on humans, right? There is a level of human interaction for your communities and that kind of shared sense of belonging inside
Yeah.
an organization, which AI is not going to give you, right?
No.
And which is critical for operating as a collective and driving that. So,
100%.
yeah, we do think there's a big bet on absolutely AI, but there's also, we don't see a future where you're ruling the human out of your learning
No, definitely not.
experience.
And also, like, bringing AI in actually just opens up a whole new host of learning requirements anyway. Like, I've recently been working on a course called prompt engineering. Like, if you asked me that when I was doing my training coordinator role, I would have been like, what is prompt engineering? But actually, it's really cool because it's about not just how do we use AI for individuals, it's how do individuals use AI on their own as well, and how do we upskill them on this amazing new thing that's out in the world now. So yeah, it is cool, but you
That
still need the people to teach the people,
I'd love for this to keep going, but I need to bring it to an end. But I don't want to ask you one last question. And we have a lot of people who first time in L&D, or people who've been in it for a few years and looking to change things up. If there's that one thing that you think someone should start doing today to change things up,
Oh God.
What's that one thing?
In L&D, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
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 Oh, I don't know. It's such a good question. I would say just try something like really different. Like if you've had an idea and you've thought no one's ever done this before, just try it, because that's the whole point of learning and development. Like you need to try new things to learn from those things to know what's going to work. And I would say honestly, just try the thing that you've probably been avoiding for a little while.
Just try it.
Honestly, just try it, because it might work, Like we, at a previous company, we did something called learning communities, and we had no idea whether it was going to work or not. And it was then the biggest learning program in the whole company because everybody loved it. And it was like, okay, that was quite cool. So just try it. Like,
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for
thank you
coming on
very
the show,
much.
Menna.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
This episode of L&D Disrupt is brought to you by How Now, the learning platform that actually makes learning matter. Because let's face it, you could push out loads of content, track skills in a spreadsheet, drown in admin, and still not know what's working. Or you could use How Now to connect your people to the skills they need. Deliver learning in the flow of work and prove it's making a difference. That's how modern companies like Depop, Trainline, Crunchyroll, SoEnergy, TomTom, Investec, and so many more do it. Learn more at gethownow.com.